Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates played with dolls and dreamed of becoming princesses, she spent her afternoons taking apart old radios and learning how engines work. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who ran a small auto repair shop, never treated her differently because she was a girl. He taught her that determination and skill mattered more than what others expected. Growing up in the 90s, Sarah watched the world change around her. The Gulf War played out on television screens, and she found herself fascinated by the pilots she saw in news reports. Something about the precision, the technology, and the courage required captured her imagination completely. When her high school guidance counselor suggested she consider nursing or teaching, Sarah politely declined and announced her intention to join the military. Her mother worried constantly. Flying was dangerous enough, but for a woman to pursue combat aviation seemed almost impossible. The military had only recently begun allowing women in combat roles, and the path was still filled with obstacles and discrimination. But Sarah's mind was made up. She spent every free moment studying, preparing for the entrance exams, and building her physical fitness. The day she left for the Air Force Academy, her father pulled her aside. His weathered hands shook slightly as he handed her a small compass that had belonged to his own father. "This kept me safe in Vietnam," he said quietly. "But you won't need luck, Mija. You've got something better. You've got the heart of a warrior." Academy life proved everything Sarah had expected and more. The academic workload was crushing, the physical demands extreme, and the social dynamics complicated by her gender. Many of her male classmates resented her presence, believing she was taking a spot that belonged to a man. Some instructors seemed determined to prove she couldn't handle the pressure. But Sarah had learned long ago that proving others wrong was one of life's greatest motivations. She studied harder than anyone else, spending nights in the library long after others had given up. When physical training pushed her to her limits, she found reserves of strength she didn't know existed. During flight simulations, she discovered she had a natural talent for the complex mental calculations and split-second decision-making that separated good pilots from great ones. Her first solo flight came during her second year. As the small training aircraft lifted off the runway, Sarah felt something click into place. The machine responded to her touch as if it were an extension of her own body. The ground fell away beneath her, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood what freedom meant. Up there, above the clouds, gender didn't matter. Politics didn't matter. Only skill, courage, and judgment counted. After graduation, Sarah entered advanced flight training. The aircraft grew larger and more complex, the missions more demanding. She learned to fly transport planes, mastering the delicate art of landing massive aircraft on short, rough airstrips. Her instructors noted her exceptional spatial awareness and ability to remain calm under pressure. Several recommended her for fighter pilot training, but at that time, women were still prohibited from combat roles in fighter aircraft. Instead, she was assigned to cargo operations, flying supplies and personnel to bases around the world. The work was important but frustrating. Sarah knew she was capable of more, but the regulations held her back. She watched male pilots with less experience and skill advance to positions she couldn't even apply for. The injustice stung, but she refused to let bitterness consume her. During this period, Sarah met Captain James Rodriguez, a fellow pilot who would later become her closest friend and confidant. Unlike many of his peers, James judged pilots solely on their abilities. He'd flown with Sarah on several missions and recognized her exceptional talent. "You're wasted on cargo runs," he told her one evening as they sat in a base cafeteria in Germany. "You should be flying combat missions." "Tell that to Congress," Sarah replied with a bitter laugh. But she appreciated having someone who understood her frustration. The late 90s brought significant changes to military policy. The restrictions on women in combat roles were gradually being lifted, and new opportunities were opening up. Sarah immediately applied for combat pilot training, knowing this might be her only chance to fulfill her true calling. The selection process was brutal. Physical and psychological evaluations pushed candidates to their breaking points. Flight tests required split-second decisions under extreme stress. Many experienced pilots washed out, unable to handle the pressure. Sarah not only survived but excelled, finishing in the top 5% of her class. Her new assignment took her to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where she would fly a C-130 gunships in support of ground operations. The aircraft was a marvel of military engineering, a heavily armed cargo plane converted into a flying artillery platform. The crew worked in perfect coordination, using sophisticated sensors and weapon systems to provide close air support for troops on the ground. Sarah's first combat mission briefing was unlike anything she'd experienced. The target was a Taliban compound in Afghanistan where intelligence indicated high-value targets were meeting. The mission would require precise flying in hostile airspace, with surface-to-air missiles and small arms fire threatening the aircraft. Lives of American soldiers on the ground depended on the accuracy of their support. As Sarah suited up for the mission, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. Every obstacle, every doubt, every person who said she didn't belong had led to this night. She was about to become one of the first women to fly combat missions in direct support of ground troops, breaking barriers that had stood for generations. The AC-130 lifted off into the darkness, its massive engines straining against the weight of fuel and ammunition. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, her voice calm as she communicated with air traffic control. Behind her, the crew prepared their weapon systems and studied intelligence reports one final time. As they approached the target area, radio chatter increased. Ground forces were in contact with the enemy and needed immediate support. Sarah brought the aircraft into a tight orbit above the battle, while the crew acquired targets through their sensors. The first shots rang out, and Sarah's combat career officially began. What none of them could have imagined was that this first mission would be followed by 88 more, each one adding to a legacy that would ultimately challenge everything people assumed about disability, courage, and the true meaning of service. The young woman from Texas, who had always been told she was different, was about to prove just how extraordinary different could be. By her 30th combat mission, Sarah Martinez had earned a reputation as one of the finest AC-130 pilots in the Air Force. Her precision flying and cool decision-making under fire had saved countless American lives. Ground commanders specifically requested her crew for the most dangerous assignments, knowing that when Sarah was at the controls, the mission would be executed flawlessly. The morning of August 15th started like many others. Sarah arrived at the briefing room before dawn, reviewing weather reports and intelligence updates while sipping strong black coffee. The mission seemed routine by her standards. Provide close air support for a special forces team conducting a raid on a suspected weapons cache in eastern Afghanistan. The target was a compound in a remote valley, surrounded by mountains that would make the flying challenging but not impossible. Major Thompson, the mission commander, spread satellite photos across the table as the crew gathered around. Intel suggests 20 to 30 enemy fighters at this location, he explained, pointing to various structures within the compound. Our guys will be going in fast and hard, but they'll need air support to suppress defensive positions. Sarah studied the terrain carefully. The compound sat in a narrow valley with steep mountain walls on both sides. Approach routes were limited, and the elevation would affect aircraft performance. More concerning were the intelligence reports of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles in the area. The enemy had been getting better equipped and more sophisticated in their tactics. Weather? Sarah asked, noting the cloud formations visible in the satellite imagery. Marginal, replied Lieutenant Hayes, the crew's navigator. Low clouds, possible precipitation. Visibility should be adequate for our sensors, but visual references might be limited. As always before a dangerous mission, Sarah called her parents. Her father's voice was steady but concerned. After 29 combat missions, he still worried every time she flew into hostile territory. "Fly safe, Mija," he said simply. "Come home to us." "Always do, Dad," Sarah replied, though they both knew that luck played a role in survival that skill alone couldn't guarantee. The AC-130 took off into a gray dawn, climbing slowly through scattered clouds toward the target area. Sarah's crew had worked together for 6 months now, and their coordination was nearly telepathic. Technical Sergeant Collins operated the weapon systems. Staff Sergeant Park handled sensors and communications, and Lieutenant Hayes navigated and coordinated with ground forces. As they approached the target area, radio chatter indicated the Special Forces team was in position and ready to begin their assault. Sarah brought the aircraft into its standard orbit pattern, a tight circle that kept the target area on the left side of the plane where the weapons could engage effectively. The compound below looked peaceful in the early morning light. Satellite intelligence had identified several buildings, but no movement was visible through the aircraft's sophisticated sensors. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and something felt wrong about the situation. "Control, this is Spectre 27, she radioed to the ground team leader. "I'm not seeing any activity down there. Are you sure about the intelligence?" "Confirmed, Spectre. Intel is solid. Multiple heat signatures detected before dawn. They're in there." The assault began at exactly 0630 hours. Sarah watched through her night vision display as the Special Forces team moved in from 3 directions, their approach coordinated with military precision. For the first few minutes, everything went according to plan. The team reached the outer walls of the compound without encountering resistance. Then the world exploded into chaos. Hidden machine gun positions opened fire simultaneously from multiple locations. The peaceful compound transformed into a deadly maze of crossfire and explosions. The Special Forces team found themselves pinned down in the open, taking casualties and calling desperately for air support. "Spectre 27, we need immediate fire support." The ground commander's voice crackled with urgency and stress. "Multiple enemy positions, danger close." Sarah's training took over. She adjusted the aircraft's orbit to optimize firing angles, while Technical Sergeant Collins identified targets through the sensor display. The first shots from their 40mm cannon struck with devastating accuracy, silencing one machine gun position and giving the ground team breathing room. But the enemy had prepared for air support. As Sarah completed her first attack run, a shoulder-fired missile streaked up from a concealed position, its heat signature blazing across the aircraft's defensive systems. The missile passed close enough that its proximity fuse detonated, sending shrapnel through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. "We're hit!" Staff Sergeant Park called out as warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. "Hydraulic pressure dropping, number 3 engine showing damage." Sarah felt the aircraft shudder and pull to the left as damaged control surfaces affected her ability to maintain stable flight. But the ground team was still under heavy fire, and there was no time to assess damage or consider retreat. She compensated for the aircraft's new handling characteristics and continued the attack. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah flew the damaged AC-130 in increasingly difficult conditions. Each orbit brought new challenges as the aircraft's systems continued to deteriorate. The enemy had clearly studied American tactics and prepared multiple surface-to-air missile positions throughout the area. A second missile struck the aircraft's left wing, tearing a massive hole in the structure and severing control cables. The plane lurched violently, nearly rolling inverted before Sarah regained control. Fuel streamed from damaged tanks, and smoke filled the cargo bay where electrical systems had been damaged by shrapnel. "Sarah, we need to get out of here!" Lieutenant Hayes shouted over the noise of rushing wind and failing engines. The bird's coming apart, but below them the Special Forces team was still fighting for their lives. 3 soldiers were wounded, and the team medic was treating them in the open while enemy fire continued to pour in from multiple directions. Without air support, the entire team would be overrun within minutes. "Negative," Sarah replied through gritted teeth as she fought to keep the crippled aircraft stable. "We stay until our guys are safe." 4. What happened next would be debated and analyzed for years afterward. With one engine completely failed, major structural damage, and control systems deteriorating by the minute, Sarah somehow maintained precise fire support for another 15 minutes. Her flying was nothing short of miraculous as she compensated for each new failure and maintained the accuracy needed for close air support. Collins continued to engage targets with deadly precision while Park coordinated medical evacuation helicopters and guided them to safe landing zones. Hayes plotted emergency landing sites and calculated fuel consumption, knowing they were rapidly approaching the point of no return. The final missile strike came without warning. A more sophisticated weapon, probably supplied by foreign sources, detonated directly beneath the aircraft's center section. The explosion was massive, tearing through critical structural components and severing the primary flight controls. The AC-130 rolled violently to the left and entered an uncontrollable spin. Sarah fought desperately with the remaining controls, but the aircraft no longer responded to her inputs. They were going down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Mayday! Mayday!" she transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Spectre 27 going down. All crew prepare for emergency landing." In those final moments, As the ground rushed up to meet them, Sarah's thoughts turned to her father and the compass he'd given her. She'd kept his faith, served with honor, and saved American lives. Whatever happened next, she could face it without regret. The crash was catastrophic. The AC-130 struck the mountainside at nearly 200 miles per hour, cartwheeling through rocky terrain before coming to rest in a deep ravine. Fuel fires erupted immediately, and the sound of the impact echoed through the valley like thunder. Rescue teams reached the crash site within hours, but they expected to find no survivors. Aircraft accidents at that speed and with that much fire damage rarely left anyone alive. When they discovered Sarah Martinez trapped in the wreckage but still breathing, it seemed like a miracle. The injuries were severe beyond description. Both legs were completely shattered, her spine was damaged in multiple locations, and internal injuries threatened her life. Medical helicopters rushed her to the trauma center at Bagram Air Base, where military surgeons worked for 18 hours to save her life. When Sarah finally regained consciousness 3 days later, the first thing she tried to do was move her legs. Nothing happened. The doctors explained gently that the spinal cord damage was extensive. She would never walk again. Her flying career was over. Her life, as she had known it, had ended in that mountain ravine. But as Sarah stared at the ceiling of the military hospital, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She had survived for a reason. The mission wasn't over. It was just beginning to take a different form. The same determination that had made her an exceptional pilot would now carry her through the greatest challenge she had ever faced. The rehabilitation center at Walter Reed Army Medical Center buzzed with activity 24 hours a day. Sarah Martinez had been there for 3 months now, and the routine had become as familiar as her old flight schedules. Physical therapy at 8, occupational therapy at 10, psychological counseling at 2, and endless hours of learning to navigate a world suddenly designed for people who could walk. The wheelchair felt foreign and clumsy at first. After spending her adult life in the precise controlled environment of aircraft cockpits, being dependent on wheels and ramps and the accessibility of buildings was deeply frustrating. Simple tasks that she'd never thought about, reaching items on high shelves, navigating curbs, transferring from bed to chair, now required careful planning and considerable effort. Amanda Foster, her physical therapist, was a former marathon runner who understood the psychology of high-performing athletes facing career-ending injuries. She pushed Sarah hard, but never harder than Sarah pushed herself. "Your upper body strength is exceptional," Dr. Foster observed during one particularly grueling session. "Most pilots don't have this kind of physical conditioning. Combat flying requires more than people think," Sarah replied, sweat streaming down her face as she completed another set of exercises designed to build the specific muscles needed for wheelchair mobility. "You're fighting G-forces, managing stress, sometimes flying for 12 hours straight. The hardest part wasn't the physical challenges. Sarah had always responded well to demanding training regimens. The hardest part was the assumption she saw in people's eyes. To most visitors and staff, she had become a victim, someone to be pitied and helped. They saw the wheelchair first and made immediate judgments about her capabilities and limitations. Major General Patricia Reynolds visited on a cold December morning. Sarah had served under her command for 2 years before the crash, and Reynolds had personally recommended her for several commendations. But even this respected superior seemed different now, her voice carrying the careful, gentle tone people used when talking to the permanently disabled. "The Air Force wants to make sure you're taken care of," General Reynolds explained as they sat in the rehabilitation center's family room. "Full medical retirement, complete benefits, assistance with housing modifications. You've served with distinction, and we honor that service." Sarah listened quietly, understanding the subtext. They wanted to pension her off quietly, minimize any embarrassment, and move on. Her usefulness to the military had ended the moment the aircraft hit the ground. She was now a public relations problem, to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. "What if I don't want to retire?" Sarah asked. General Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "Sarah, I understand this is difficult to accept, but your flying days are over. There's simply no way to accommodate your condition in a cockpit environment." "I'm not talking about flying," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm talking about continuing to serve. There are other ways to contribute to the mission." The conversation ended with polite promises to explore options. but Sarah could see in the general's eyes that no one was seriously considering keeping a wheelchair-bound officer on active duty. The military was an organization built around physical capability and conformity. Disability was seen as incompatible with effective service. That evening, Sarah called her father for their weekly conversation. His voice was stronger now than it had been in the first weeks after the crash, when he'd flown to Germany to be with her during the worst of the medical crisis. "How are the doctors treating you, Mija?" "They're excellent," Sarah replied honestly, "but they're preparing me for civilian life. Everyone assumes my military career is over." There was a long pause before her father spoke again. "What do you want to do?" It was the question everyone else had stopped asking. Family members, friends, and medical staff, all focused on helping her accept her new limitations. Only her father was still interested in her aspirations rather than her accommodations. "I want to prove them wrong," Sarah said. "I want to show that my value to the Air Force wasn't just in my legs." Over the following months, Sarah began developing a plan that would challenge every assumption about disability and military service. She researched military roles that required intelligence, experience, and strategic thinking rather than physical mobility. She studied the Americans with Disabilities Act and military disability policies, looking for precedents and opportunities. Her research revealed that while no wheelchair-using officer had ever remained on active flying status, there were limited examples of disabled personnel continuing in support roles. The key was demonstrating that her condition didn't impair her ability to perform essential job functions. Sarah also began reaching out to other disabled veterans, particularly those who had found ways to continue meaningful careers after service. She connected with a former Navy SEAL who had lost both legs to an IED but now worked as a counterterrorism consultant. She spoke with an Army helicopter pilot who had become a respected military historian after losing her sight in a training accident. Each conversation reinforced the same message. The biggest barriers weren't physical, but psychological. Society, including the military, had preconceived notions about what disabled people could and couldn't accomplish. Breaking through those assumptions required not just competence but exceptional performance that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Dr. Michael Harrison, a psychologist who specialized in working with combat veterans, became an unexpected ally. Unlike many counselors who focused on helping patients accept their limitations, Dr. Harrison was intrigued by Sarah's determination to expand what was considered possible. "You're dealing with two separate but related challenges," he explained during one of their sessions. "Physical adaptation to your disability, which you're handling remarkably well, and societal perception of your capabilities, which is actually the bigger obstacle." Sarah had been thinking the same thing. The wheelchair was becoming natural to her. She could navigate obstacles, transfer independently, and had even begun playing wheelchair basketball in the rehabilitation center's recreation program. But changing how others saw her would require a much more dramatic demonstration. That demonstration came sooner than expected. A terrorist attack at a shopping mall in Virginia created a complex hostage situation that stretched local law enforcement resources to their limits. The FBI's hostage rescue team was deployed, but they needed intelligence analysis to understand the building's layout, predict suspect movements, and plan tactical approaches. Sarah had spent months during her recovery studying the tactical analysis techniques used by Special Operations Forces. When she learned about the crisis through news reports, she contacted her former squadron commander and offered to assist with intelligence analysis. The response was initially dismissive. What could a hospitalized pilot contribute to an active law enforcement operation? But as the situation deteriorated and negotiations stalled, desperation overcame skepticism. Sarah was given access to building blueprints, security camera feeds, and communication intercepts. Working from her hospital bed with a laptop and secure communications link, she began applying the same analytical skills that had made her an exceptional combat pilot. Her analysis was brilliant. Using architectural drawings and thermal imaging data, Sarah identified hidden passages that suspects were likely using to move through the building undetected. She calculated sight lines and predicted optimal positions for sniper teams. Most importantly, she identified a ventilation shaft that could provide access for rescue teams without alerting the hostages' captors. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations. All hostages were rescued unharmed, and the suspects were captured without a single shot being fired. FBI agents later said the intelligence analysis had been crucial to their success, providing insights that field teams had missed despite being on scene for hours. News of Sarah's contribution spread quickly through military and law enforcement circles. Here was undeniable proof that her value to national security hadn't diminished with her physical disability. The same spatial reasoning, tactical thinking, and analytical skills that had made her a superior pilot were directly transferable to other critical missions. Suddenly, the conversations about her future began changing. Instead of focusing solely on medical retirement and benefits, commanders started discussing ways to utilize her unique combination of combat experience and analytical capabilities. The Air Force had invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in her training and development. Maybe there was a way to continue benefiting from that investment. The breakthrough came when Colonel James Mitchell, director of the Air Force's Tactical Analysis Center, visited Walter Reed. He'd heard about Sarah's role in the hostage rescue and was intrigued by the possibility of incorporating her skills into his organization's mission. "We analyze complex combat scenarios and develop tactical recommendations for field commanders," Colonel Mitchell explained. "It requires understanding aircraft capabilities, enemy tactics, terrain factors, and human psychology under stress. Your combat experience gives you insights that our current analysts simply don't have." For the first time since the crash, Sarah felt genuinely hopeful about her future. This wasn't charity or accommodation. It was recognition that her skills and experience had value independent of her physical condition. The mission was changing, but it was still a mission. The position would require proving herself all over again. There would be skeptics who doubted her capabilities, colleagues who saw her as a diversity hire rather than a qualified professional, and the constant challenge of overcoming assumptions about what wheelchair users could accomplish. But Sarah had faced skeptics before. Every step of her career had involved proving that she belonged in spaces where women weren't expected to succeed. Now she would prove that disabled veterans could continue serving their country in meaningful ways, contributing to national security through intelligence and determination rather than physical prowess alone. The young woman who had dreamed of flying was about to discover that there were many ways to soar. The Tactical Analysis Center occupied 3 floors of a nondescript building near the Pentagon, its existence known only to a select few with the highest security clearances. Sarah Martinez rolled her wheelchair through the main entrance on her first day, immediately aware of the stares and whispered conversations from personnel who had never seen a wheelchair-using officer in an active duty position. Colonel Mitchell had prepared his staff for her arrival, but preparation didn't eliminate surprise. The center employed some of the military's brightest minds, former special operations officers, intelligence specialists, and strategic planners who analyzed threats and developed tactical recommendations for commanders worldwide. None of them had expected their newest colleague to navigate the corridors on wheels. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell announced as Sarah entered the main briefing room, "meet Major Martinez. She brings 30 combat missions worth of first-hand experience to our analytical capabilities." Sarah noticed how he emphasized her rank and experience rather than her disability. It was a small gesture that made a significant difference in how the room responded. Several officers approached after the briefing to welcome her and express genuine curiosity about her combat experiences. But not everyone was receptive. Captain Bradley Stokes, a former Army Ranger who had transitioned to intelligence work after a training injury, made his skepticism clear during their first interaction. "No offense intended," he said in a tone that suggested offense was exactly what he intended. "But how can someone who's never going to see combat again provide relevant tactical analysis?" Sarah had expected this challenge and was prepared for it. "Combat analysis isn't about whether you can currently fight," she replied calmly. "It's about understanding how fights develop, how decisions affect outcomes, and how terrain and technology influence tactics. My disability doesn't erase my experience or affect my ability to think strategically." The first major test came within her second week. Intelligence reports indicated that terrorist groups in Somalia were using new tactics to avoid detection by American surveillance systems. Field commanders needed analysis of enemy movement patterns and recommendations for counter-tactics that could restore American advantages. Sarah spent 3 days studying satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and after-action reports from recent engagements. She approached the problem the same way she had analyzed combat missions, systematically, considering every variable that could affect the outcome. Her background as a pilot gave her unique insights into how surveillance aircraft operated and where their limitations created exploitable vulnerabilities. Her briefing to senior commanders was methodical and comprehensive. She identified patterns in enemy movements that ground-based analysts had missed, explained how terrain features were being used to defeat aerial surveillance, and recommended specific changes to flight patterns and sensor employment that would restore American detection capabilities. The recommendations were implemented immediately, and within 2 weeks, field reports confirmed their effectiveness. Enemy groups that had been successfully evading detection were suddenly being located and engaged by American forces. The tactical advantage had shifted back to American favor. Word of Sarah's analytical success spread quickly through the intelligence community. Her combination of operational experience and strategic thinking was exactly what the military needed to understand increasingly sophisticated adversaries. Requests for her analysis began arriving from combat commands around the world. The workload was intense but deeply satisfying. Sarah found herself analyzing everything from urban combat scenarios in Iraq to maritime security threats in the South China Sea. Each assignment required understanding different environments, enemy capabilities, and American force structures. Her combat experience provided context that purely academic analysts couldn't match. But the most significant challenge came from an unexpected source. A prestigious military think tank invited Sarah to participate in a wargame exercise, a week-long simulation where military experts role-played potential conflicts to identify strategic weaknesses and develop better tactics. The exercise focused on a hypothetical conflict in Eastern Europe, where American forces would need to operate in contested airspace. Sarah was assigned to the Red Team, playing the role of enemy commanders and trying to defeat American tactics. The other participants were impressive: active duty generals, retired special operations officers, and defense intellectuals with decades of experience. Sarah was the only wheelchair user in the group, and initially she sensed some uncertainty about whether she belonged in such a high-level strategic discussion. Those doubts evaporated quickly. Sarah's understanding of aircraft capabilities and limitations, gained through actual combat experience, allowed her to devise defensive strategies that consistently outmaneuvered the Blue Team's attacks. She identified vulnerabilities in American tactics that academic theorists had missed, forcing the exercise controllers to adjust scenarios when her defensive measures proved too effective. On the third day of the exercise, Sarah proposed a defensive strategy so innovative that it stopped the simulation entirely. She had identified a way to use civilian infrastructure and natural terrain features to create dead zones where American surveillance and communication systems would be degraded, allowing enemy forces to operate with much greater freedom. General Patricia Morrison, who was observing the exercise, called for an immediate break to discuss Sarah's proposal with the control team. "This changes everything we thought we knew about contested environments," she said. "If enemy forces actually implemented these tactics, our current doctrine would be seriously challenged." The exercise resumed with modifications based on Sarah's insights, and American forces struggled to adapt to the new tactical environment. What had been designed as a confidence-building exercise became a sobering lesson in the need for more sophisticated thinking about future conflicts. After the exercise, General Morrison approached Sarah privately. "Your performance this week was exceptional," she said. "We need this kind of analytical thinking at the highest levels of defense planning. Would you be interested in a position at the National Defense University?" The offer was extraordinary. An opportunity to teach and mentor the next generation of military leaders while continuing to conduct strategic analysis at the national level. It represented recognition that Sarah's contributions to national security extended far beyond her specific disability accommodations. But accepting the position would require another difficult transition. The National Defense University was an even more traditional environment, where physical presence and conformity had always been emphasized. Sarah would again be breaking new ground, challenging assumptions about what military educators should look like. She accepted the position immediately. The months that followed brought a whirlwind of activity. Sarah moved to Washington, adapted to a new academic environment. Students appreciated her directness and practical approach. Unlike many academic instructors who taught tactics they had only read about, Sarah could describe exactly how different strategies felt when implemented under fire. Her war stories weren't academic exercises. They were lessons learned through personal experience that could save lives in future conflicts. The media attention was inevitable. Sarah's story, the combat pilot who had overcome disability to continue serving at the highest levels of military analysis, captured public imagination. Interview requests came from major news networks, magazines, and documentary filmmakers. Sarah was selective about media appearances, understanding that every interview was an opportunity to change perceptions about disability and capability. She focused on messages that emphasized competence over inspiration, substance over sentiment. Her goal was to normalize the idea that disabled veterans could continue contributing to national security, rather than becoming objects of pity or admiration. The most significant media opportunity came when 60 Minutes proposed a feature story about her career and current role. The interview would reach millions of viewers and could significantly influence public perceptions about disability and military service. Sarah agreed on the condition that the story focus primarily on her current work rather than her personal struggle with disability. She wanted viewers to understand that her value to the military came from her skills and experience, not from overcoming adversity. The interview was conducted at the National Defense University, with cameras capturing her teaching a class on combat analysis and briefing senior officers on current tactical challenges. The reporter, initially focused on the human interest angle of her story, became genuinely interested in her professional expertise. "What surprises people most about your current role?" the reporter asked. "They expect my contributions to be limited or somehow diminished because I use a wheelchair," Sarah replied. "But tactical analysis requires mental capabilities, understanding patterns, predicting behaviors, synthesizing complex information. My disability doesn't affect those abilities at all." The 60 Minutes piece aired on a Sunday evening and generated enormous response. Emails poured in from disabled veterans who had been inspired to pursue continued careers, from military commanders who wanted to consult with Sarah on tactical problems, and from disability rights advocates who appreciated her emphasis on capability over limitation. But the most meaningful response came from her father, who called the morning after the broadcast. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "Mija, I always knew you were destined for great things. But watching you last night, seeing how you've turned your experience into something that helps others, I've never been prouder." Sarah understood that her story had become larger than her personal journey. She represented possibilities that many people had never considered, that disability didn't have to mean the end of meaningful contribution, that military service could continue in different forms, and that society's assumptions about capability were often more limiting than actual physical limitations. Looking back on her career, Sarah realized that every challenge had prepared her for the next phase of her mission. Learning to fly had taught her precision and decision-making under pressure. Combat experience had shown her how theoretical knowledge translated into life and death situations. Adapting to disability had forced her to think creatively about problems and solutions. Now, as she briefed Pentagon officials on emerging security threats and taught future military leaders to think more strategically about complex challenges, Sarah understood that her greatest achievements were still ahead. The crash that had seemed like an ending had actually been a transformation, from someone who executed tactics to someone who shaped them, from a single pilot making individual decisions to an analyst whose insights affected thousands of service members worldwide. The assumptions people had made about her capabilities based on her wheelchair had all been proven wrong, but more importantly, she had proven that the definition of military service itself was broader than anyone had previously imagined. Her 89 combat missions had been just the beginning of a career that would ultimately touch every aspect of American defense strategy, demonstrating that true warriors adapt, overcome, and continue serving regardless of the challenges they face. The young girl from Texas who had dreamed of flying had learned that there were many ways to soar, many battles to fight, and many victories to achieve. The mission continued, and Sarah Martinez remained at the center of it all, proving every day that determination and expertise could overcome any assumption about limitation.